Yeah, thanks, Ali. Just on Dr. Al-Ghazi's point about the BBC being the truth, that may have been the view at one point, but I'm going to disappoint him with the stuff that we found in our latest report, which has been described as incredibly damning by people like Peter Auburn, senior conservative journalist in the British media for the last 30 years. I think it's important to start before October the 7th. One of the things the media has tried to do is to anchor everything on October the 7th. October the 7th being ground zero. This is where it all starts. This was the evil of Hamas. This is what caused all of this. And, you know, Rachel highlighted some examples and some headlines from different media organizations throughout this, you know, from post-October the 7th. There's one headline that really caught my eye on October the 4th, 2023 from The Guardian. The headline went something like, the Palestinian people in Gaza were protesting on the border wall, and the headline read, Palestinians receive bullet wounds on ankles. No mention of the Israelis, no mention of who's shooting them. And I mean, I've received presents, I've received, you know, all sorts of things. I've never received bullet wounds, and it's not the type of language I would use to describe if I ever had received them, or if I ever had been shot. So I think it's important to remember that this, I mean, the whole thing didn't start on October the 7th. There's obviously a huge background to this and context. But even within the media, this kind of behavior that we've seen and the kind of reporting we've seen since October the 7th is not unique to this period. This was going on for a long, long time. What we've done at the Center for Media Monitoring, and our main purpose and our sort of USP as it was, is to look at the representation of Muslims and Islam in the British media. And quite quickly, we've noticed that there's a huge overlap with the Israel-Palestine issue and what's happened, particularly in Gaza. When October the 7th did happen, there was a huge influx of people writing into us, asking if we're monitoring the media on this. And so we've produced two reports, the latest one being an in-depth look at the BBC's coverage and how the BBC has performed. And I think one of the justifications for that being, I mean, the two major points, one being that if you noticed very early on in the current, I don't like to call it conflict, but I'll use that word for this purpose. When Rishi Sunak, when he was Prime Minister, and he was sat with the Israeli President, Isaac Herzog, before the world's media and in front of the world's screens, was lobbying the British Prime Minister about bringing the BBC into line. He complaining about the BBC, that the BBC is anti-Israel. And following that, you've had these plethora of organizations, pro-Israel organizations, media monitoring organizations, backed by the right-wing media in Britain, the Telegraph, the Daily Mail, the Times, all of these, making accusation after accusation against the BBC and accusing the BBC of being very pro-Palestinian and very anti-Israeli. And yet, as Rachel mentioned, when you look at a lot of the examples on social media, when you look at a lot of the screenshots of headlines, etc., it's quite clear that they're not. Israel is, I mean, from the very framing of this whole thing, Israel is either omitted or it's given an excuse as to why it's committing the atrocities that it has been doing. And so we thought it's very important to sort of put the skin on all of those bones, because that's what the Center for Media Monitoring, CfMM as we're known, has been very good at in the past. And so we produced this study. We looked at 35,000 BBC items, both online and across broadcast radio and television. And we used AI as well as human verification to analyze all of this. And even accounting for margins of error, which you have in reports, the results were quite I mean, the results told us what we all suspected. So if I can take you through some of those statistics just to highlight exactly what we're trying to say. So the BBC ran an almost equal number of articles, of humanizing articles, where they profiled a victim between Israeli victims and Palestinian victims, despite the fact that there were 34 times more Palestinian deaths in Gaza. So despite this huge disparity, you had these individual profiles of people, particularly hostages, hostage families, and it was noticeable that whenever there was a sort of atrocity or a new atrocity committed against people in Gaza, you had a sort of humanizing story about an Israeli hostage or what was going on in Tel Aviv or something like that. We analyzed language, and we looked at the use of what we call emotive terms. One of the reasons for that being that BBC journalists internally within the organization had complained when they wrote their letters to the people at the top, the editors. They complained about the language that was being used. So words like slaughtered and massacre and atrocities were being exclusively applied, what they felt, to describe Israeli victims as opposed to Palestinian ones. And just to give you one example, and we looked at, so we separated the use of these words on screen by guests, and particularly pro-Israel guests, who described the events of October the 7th as a massacre against the Israeli people, as people were slaughtered, etc. So we split the use of those words when they were being used by guests on the programs and when they were being used by the presenters themselves. And we found, for example, that the word massacre was used 18 times more to describe the deaths and victims of attacks by Hamas as opposed to the Palestinian victims. So when those journalists wrote that letter, we found that their complaint about the use of emotive language was true. It couldn't be denied. The disparity was huge. Some words, for example, the word butchered was used exclusively to describe Israeli victims. So even in the language, we found that there was this huge disparity where the real emotive terms and the terms that you can say ascribe intent, things like murder, for example. So Israelis are murdered, whereas that word was hardly ever used to describe what's gone on in Gaza, despite the tens of thousands, which some say is a conservative estimate, of Palestinian deaths. So we looked at, across TV and radio, 70% of all of these emotive terms were used by BBC journalists to describe Israeli victims. One of our leading stats is that 33 times, the BBC gave Israeli deaths 33 times more coverage across articles, online articles, when measured on a per fatality basis. So despite this huge disparity in deaths between Palestinians and Israelis, the BBC effectively giving 33 times as much coverage to Israeli victims, which tells a story in itself. In terms of interviewing, the BBC interviewed significantly fewer Palestinians than Israelis. So there was 2,350 Israeli representatives interviewed and only 1,085 Palestinians across TV and radio. And in terms of the role of the journalists themselves, we found that the presenters shared Israeli perspectives 11 times more frequently than Palestinian ones. So when Palestinian guests were coming on, and they were making a point, part of the armory of the presenters was to hit back with, well, Israel would say this, well, Israel denies this, well, the Israelis are doing this. And that feeds into the whole aspect of genocide. We looked at, for example, how whenever this term of genocide was mentioned by the Palestinians, and we found over 100 occasions where pro-Palestinian guests or others would come on and allege or describe what was going on in Gaza, or what is still going on in Gaza, as a genocide. And BBC presenters themselves were shutting this down. It was almost as if there's this institutional message going around that there can be no discussion about genocide. And there was one example from Newsnight where Kirsty Walker, I think, who's an ex-presenter now, she's left, when Francesca Albanese mentioned the term genocide, Kirsty Walker's response was, can we just be clear that that's not what's happening here? Genocide is not what's happening here. So she's made that observation herself, she's made that conclusion herself, and they've put that view. So basically the BBC is a sort of genocide-free zone. You can't mention the words genocide. October the 7th, I mentioned at the very start, the whole thing is anchored on October the 7th. So, the attacks of October the 7th are referenced in at least 40% of BBC online articles. And you'll notice this, if you read a BBC news report on Gaza, which is becoming less frequent, by the way, when we did our launch event, the BBC, to his credit, Richard Burgess, who happens to be the news director, was there, and he faced quite a grilling. And one of his, he made the point that there's significantly less coverage now on the BBC on Gaza, because it seems to be, by audience measurements, less people seem to be interested in this story. My response to that would be, well, given your coverage, most people are probably switched off, and that being the reason as to why there's less eyeballs and ears on your coverage. But like I said, 40% of all articles, so you'll see an article that's talking about an event that's happened in Gaza, the killing of Palestinians, and towards the end of the article, or in the middle of the article somewhere, there will always be a reference back to October the 7th. This all started on October the 7th when Hamas gunmen entered Israel and killed 1,200 Israelis. So it's all anchored there. But when it comes to, for example, occupation and the wider context of why this all took place, we found that only 0.5% of articles had any mention of Israel's occupation and the violence against Palestinians pre-October the 7th. There was zero mentions on the BBC of Netanyahu's genocidal remarks, where the biblical references to Amalek and other references. So the BBC basically ignored that. As I mentioned, 100 plus occasions where BBC presenters actively shut down genocide claims. Significantly larger number of Palestinians being detained over a larger period of time, described as prisoners, etc. And yet, Israeli hostages are mentioned 5.3 times more than Palestinian detainees across BBC coverage, so always referring back to the hostages. So the overall framing being one that would be acceptable to sort of the powers that be in Israel. Israel wants this framed as, this is all about the hostages. It's got nothing to, we are doing all this for our people, so we can go in and raise Gaza to the ground and do whatever we want on the justification of hostages. And the media complicity behind that is to effectively anchor everything around those Israeli talking points. During the January 2025 hostage exchanges, 70% of articles focused on Israeli hostages, despite significantly more Palestinian prisoners and those who have been held for many, many years, sometimes decades, being released. So again, everything's anchored around the hostages. Coming to what Dr. Al-Ghazi mentioned and Rachel mentioned as well about journalists being killed, we found that only 6% of the journalists that were killed there was any kind of report about their killing on the BBC. So there doesn't even seem to be this sort of unifying or coverage about people who are within the industry, colleagues of journalists normally see other journalists as their colleagues, but there doesn't seem to be this sympathy. When the Israelis are killing journalists and well documented, there seems to be a huge absence of this coverage. And, you know, I focused on the BBC because this is our latest report, and there has been quite for our purposes anyway, there's been a great response to this and quite good coverage across the media. But we can sort of extrapolate this across the British media and the wider Western media, and there's plentiful examples of the coverage, you know, sort of post October the 7th, where many of the news channels and many newspapers have, you know, framed this whole thing. And to go back to the early days of October 7th, many of them reported on the beheaded baby story, which was subsequently proved to be false. And one thing that I have to say is, when the press regulator, IPSO, was made aware of this, they took no action. They took no action, despite 7 front pages of British newspapers mentioning that story. There was no action against them to say, you have to clarify that this wasn't a true story. And we see repetition of that, especially on the right-wing news channels. It all goes back to, Hamas, the Palestinians, they murdered babies, they beheaded babies. You still continue to hear that across. And just lastly, I mean, there have been occasions of very, very good reporting. And I want to highlight one example, just to go back to the beheaded babies thing. The Times produced an investigation piece, a very, very good investigation piece, where they proved that a lot of the information that came, that was sort of given to the media behind that story and to frame that story, came from people who were incredibly unreliable, couldn't be trusted. And it was a very good investigative piece. And the backlash that the journalist got on Twitter from pro-Israel media monitoring groups was incredible. And the Times' response to that was, we're looking into this, we're investigating it. So there's this, so even when journalists are doing an incredible job, I mean, one person I'd mention is Alex Crawford, who's constantly called out the fact that journalists are not allowed access to Gaza. Why are journalists not allowed access to Gaza? They need to be given access to Gaza so that they can report the realities on the ground. There has been this shutting down of journalists, both within the newsrooms and from the pressure that comes externally. So there has been good reporting, but overall, I mean, from what we found, I think is indisputable. The evidence is there to back up the anecdotal stuff that everybody's seen. So please do read the report and share it widely.